people here. We have 21 attendees. So
excellent.
Great. So we get started?
Let's get started.
All right. Hi, everybody, and welcome to Who Writers Read. I'm Ginger Eager, one of your co-hosts.
And I'm Jodie Forster, Ginger's co-host, and thanks so much for joining us. Who Writers Read is a monthly literary salon featuring writers discussing their reading life, the books that have influenced and inspired their own work, and what books are you reading now? Our guests today are the novelist, memoirist, and short story writer Pam Houston, whose latest book, Airmail, Letters of Politics, Pandemics, and Place, is an exchange of emails with essayist Amy Irving during the first few months of the COVID-19 pandemic. Also joining the conversation is the novelist, memoirist, and essayist Gina Frangello, whose latest book is the memoir, Blow Your House Down, a story of family, feminism, and treason.
Thanks. So I will read an intro we'll start with Pam. I'll read Pam's intro and then Pam can read, and then I'll read Gina's intro, and then Gina will read for 5 minutes. And then we'll have a conversation. And for the last 10 minutes or so, we'll take questions. So if you have any questions, panelists, you can put them in the bottom. We have a Q&A section. You can also put them in chat. I'll check both. So let's see. Pam Houston is the author of the memoir Deep Creek, Finding Hope in the High Country, as well as 2 novels, Contents May Have Shifted and Sighthound, 2 collections of short stories, Cowboys Are My Weakness and Waltzing the Cat, and a collection of essays, A Little More About Me. Her stories have been selected for volumes of the O. Henry Awards, the Pushcart Prize, Best American Travel Writing, and Best American Short Stories of the Century, among other anthologies. She is the winner of the Western States Book Award, the Willa Award for Contemporary Fiction, the Evil Companions Literary Award, and several teaching awards. She teaches in the low-res MFA program at the Institute of American Indian Arts, is professor of English at UC Davis, and co-founder and creative director of the literary nonprofit Writing by Writers. She lives at 9,000 feet above sea level near the headwaters of the Rio Grande.
Well, hi, everyone. Hi, Gina. That's the wrong book. You're holding up the wrong book. Thank you for having me on the show. I'm excited to talk with Gina about our writing lives. I forgot we were supposed to read, but I just happened to have a copy of Airmail right here, so that worked out. So I'm going to read 5 minutes. Okay, I'm going to read 2 of these letters, and one from kind of midway through the book and one from kind of the end of the book. Just a little more about this book. Orion Magazine asked Amy Irvine and I to write letters back and forth during the pandemic as part of their series called Together Apart. And we wrote the 3,000 words worth of letters for them. We didn't know each other. We knew each other's work, but we didn't know each other in person. And once we had about 6 letters written, which was the assignment, we realized we were kind of forging a sisterhood and a friendship, and didn't want to stop writing. So we kept writing. And then we got about 35,000 words, so about 10 times that original amount. And we were like, hey, this is something here that we have. We have something here. And it might just be something that would make some sort of difference in the 2020 election. So we found a publisher, the wonderful Torrey House, all women's publisher out of Utah. And they just said yes. And we got the books out and we went on a crazy book tour where we were dodging COVID outbreaks and fires and selling books out of the back of our car. And there would be literally, people would be like, can you meet me at the top of Red Mountain Pass with 12 copies? You know, we were like the women of the French Resistance, we like to say about ourselves rather grandiosely, baking our missives into baguettes. Anyway, I'm going to give you a sample of a couple of these letters so you see how it gets. I will only read mine because I don't feel right reading Amy's, but Amy's are awesome. This is April 12th, 2020. Hi, Amy. I watched a woman's husband die last night in real time on Twitter. It was no one I knew. She tweeted, they took him to the hospital. They had the breathing thing attached and doing chest compressions. I can't go with him. Then she tweeted, he's too young for this. I'm supposed to go first. Then she tweeted, I can do nothing here. I can't do anything. They'll call me. What can I do? I can't go to the hospital. And then I just don't know what to do. And then he's died. They couldn't bring him back. And then Leah M., a person I only know from Twitter, a person I follow because she's smart about politics, tweeted back, Lisa, we don't know each other, but I have 20 years experience as a therapist. If you want to talk, I just followed you so you can DM me. I'll be up until at least midnight. No charge, of course, just two humans connecting. And then, can you drink something with sugar in it, some tea or juice, and make sure you are warm enough? Put a hoodie on or put a fluffy blanket around your shoulders. And please remember to take deep belly breaths. Inhale fully through your nose, letting your belly expand, and exhaling through gently pursed lips. If your hands or other extremities start to tingle or feel numb, sit or lie down, okay? This is what tenderness looks like in the world we have made, reminding one another to breathe. Mike and I went back to that new trail this evening. This is the only time it will be viable because it's snow covered all winter and the cows own it from mid-May till September. But right now it's heaven. There are at least 20 nesting pairs of bluebirds along 100 yards of creek. It's wind protected and alive with robins and mallards and geese and some little bird that looks like a towhee, but I think is too small to be one. I listened hard for the rattle of a belted kingfisher. All my life, she's been my everything's going to be okay after all sighting, uncanny in her ability to show up just when I fear all hope is lost. But there was not sight nor sound of her today along that creek full of birds, which either means all hope is not lost yet, or else everything is not going to be okay. On the way home in the car, we passed the herd of Rocky Mountain Bighorn who live upriver, tons of lambs this season. They're having trouble keeping those babies alive beyond a year, and there's a lot of discussion about the domesticated sheep the Basque shepherds run through here along the Central Stock driveway every summer, infecting them. But the herd couldn't look healthier right now. Around the Big Bend in the Rio Grande, we saw about 100 elk and watched from at least a mile away as they leapt the fence one by one on their way back up the mountain. When they all got over, we proceeded, but as we passed the place where they had crossed, we saw that a yearling cow had gotten two legs twisted in the fence. We both got out and tried to pull the fence, but her legs were locked down tight. 3 strands wrapped around 2 legs and each other, the worst twist there is. So we raced to the house, about 10 minutes downriver to the bridge and then back up the other side, threw the dogs inside, grabbed the wire cutters and raced back. The whole way back, going way too fast on the gravel road, I was thinking, she can't die. She can't cut her legs all the way through. We cannot be having COVID and Trump selling off the North Fork and drilling the fucking Arctic and the cyanide bombs killing wolf puppies and states needing to send local police to make sure the federal government does not seize the PPE they bought from China for their frontline workers and a dead yearling elk. And who knows if it was our fault for pulling over to watch them cross. We were far away, but still, maybe this yearling cow smelled the dogs in the car and it was enough to make her lose her concentration. What I'm trying to say is that the elk became everything. It was all 21,000 COVID victims. It was the Twitter lady's dead husband. It was the post office in the 2020 election, but most of all, it was a yearling elk who ought not to have to jump over barbed wire fences as tall as she is to get a fucking drink of water. One more scourge we have brought down upon the American West. And then we were back, and I was bracing myself for her having, in our absence, cut her tendons all the way through, or deep enough that she wouldn't be able to walk when we cut her down. We looked, and she just wasn't there. We drove up and down twice and saw no cut fence. We got out and walked, and I found the place she'd been, the scuff marks her body had made when she was hanging. And the fence was torqued a little, but not cut anywhere. We had not been gone 20 minutes. There are hardly any cars on the road right now, and I could see across the river to the spot she was nearly the whole time we were driving. But we had passed one car right after we left her. And there would have been 3 or 4 minutes when the guy in that car could have set her free before we could see across the river again. Maybe he was a cowboy so fluent in barbed wire fences, he knew some magic trick to get those legs out. But with Mike and I both trying, we couldn't budge it. Or maybe the elk somehow kicked out on her own, which seems even more impossible given how tight those legs were wrapped. My first thought when we couldn't find her was that she had been a ghost of the elk who had lost her life in my barbed wire 4 or 5 years ago at the ranch, or some other spirit thing, an omen, a sign, a girl elk come to tell me Trump is about to start jailing women who speak out against him, maybe as early as next week, and it's time to make for Canada and take a walk through that borderland forest. When I found the spot where she'd been, not a speck of blood anywhere, I thought it might be a sign of a different kind, that somehow this virus will change hearts and minds and the way we walk on the earth and what kind of person we want to be president. Maybe the female kind. Maybe against all odds, the wild earth will escape. Maybe the teenage girl up came along this afternoon, care, sleep, OSHA, garlic, and ginger. Maybe the elk was here to say, I know you think you're free again. What does it mean to kick just right? To upend a plate full of turkey and stuffing onto a misogynist lap? To point blank ask the men in our lives if it's okay with the reporters how Trump speaks about all women, if they are cool with the fact that America can't find 9 individuals to sit on the Supreme Court who haven't raped anybody? I was at a writer thing in Aspen nearly a decade ago, being taken out for expensive sushi. And there was a recent Pulitzer Prize and another male writer fawning all over him. And after some time, the fawning man remembered I was at the table. And he said to the recent Pulitzer Prize winner, have you read Pam's new book? Which at the time was Contents May Have Shifted. And the recent Pulitzer Prize winner, who, by the way, no one had ever heard of until he came out of nowhere to win the Pulitzer Prize, smiled broadly and said, oh no, I don't actually read books by women. And the terrible, terrible thing I must confess to you now is that I didn't say eating my sushi. And that makes me hope our girl elk kicked her out with Lee Cowboy. And it makes me think we need a plan, and a good one. Happy Easter, whatever that means. Pam.
Pam, the video froze on you through the reading, though we still heard your voice. I wonder if it's possible for you to refresh your computer, or what we're doing here. I'm not sure what the best thing would be to do.
Yes.
Did you hear that, Pam?
I'll go out and I'll.
Okay.
We can carry on.
Yes. I'll go out and I'll come back in.
We can hear you perfectly, though. That's a great picture, too.
Lammy.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right, Gina, I'm going to go ahead and read your bio. And then would you like to read?
I just wanted to make sure that, because I think Pam said she was reading 2 letters and that seemed like one. So I think she may not be finished. So I don't want to start before she comes back, I guess.
No, hello. I said that was longer than I thought. So I was just going to stop there. Thank you though.
Awesome.
All right. Gina Frangello's memoir, Blow Your House Down, A Story of Family, Feminism, and Treason, was an editor's pick at the New York Times and received starred reviews in Publishers Weekly, Book Page, and Library Journal. She is also the author of 4 books of fiction, most recently A Life in Men, which is under development with Charlize Theron's production company, Denver and Delilah, in conjunction with Universal Studios Cable Productions, and Every Kind of Wanting, which appeared on several best of lists in 2016, including Chicago Magazine and the Chicago Review of Books. She is the creative nonfiction editor at the Los Angeles Review of Books and runs a full-service company for writers, Circe Consulting, with Emily Rapp Black. Gina has previously served as an editor at The Rumpus, The Nervous Breakdown, The Coachella Review, Tri-Quarterly Online, and Other Voices magazine, where she launched and ran the press Other Voices Books until 2014. Her short stories, essays, book reviews, and interviews have appeared in such venues as Salon, the LA Times, Psychology Today, the Boston Globe, Plowshares, and many other publications. She has taught creative writing at the undergrad and graduate level for roughly a quarter of a century and recently returned to the PhD program she dropped out of in 1999 and completed her degree this summer. She lives mainly in Chicago and occasionally in the California desert.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. Just even hearing Other Voices, I think back of Pam being one of the absolute highlights of my time running Other Voices, because she had a short story selected for the best American short stories of the century that we had originally published. So it's really nice to be here. And also, I just want to say that for so many women, myself included, Pam's social media presence leading up to the election was one of the things that prevented me from jumping off a roof. So thank you for that. And, glad to be in a new, if still very strange era. I'm going to read a little bit just from the very beginning of the book. It's from the opening section called The Story of A. And it begins with a quote that says, "The lie which elates us is dearer than 1,000 sober truths." And that's Anton Chekhov misquoting Pushkin. A is for adulteress, but you knew that. There's virtually no history of literature without the adulteress. Anna Karenina, Emma Bovary, Hester Prynne, Daisy Buchanan, Molly Bloom. The adulteress throws herself in front of a train, runs over her husband's lover with a car, walks into the ocean intent on dying without a care for her children. A is for adulteress, agent of ruin, woman. A is for accused. Researchers at Cardiff Metropolitan University revealed that when there has been infidelity in a marriage, most wives tend to blame the other woman, whereas most husbands see their cheating wife as the guilty party. Basically, whoever dropped dead in the broom closet, the adulteress did it. A is for author. Allow me to reveal the A on my breast. For the sake of this narrative, my name might as well be A. Once a woman becomes an adulteress, her other identities, mother, daughter, friend, editor, writer, teacher, become largely invisible to others, as irrelevant as the clothing she whorishly, treasonously shed. A is for asshole. There is no slur for men to match the equivalent of mistress or even other woman. Philanderer doesn't have the same punch and is not sex specific. Cuckold denotes a man who is being cheated on. A player or even a dog can be single or married. An asshole can be the guy who took your parking space at Trader Joe's, as well as the man who fucked your wife. There are no names specifically for men who break their promises to women. A is for age. For the first time in documented human history, among adults 18 to 29 who have ever been married, a general social survey reports that women are marginally more likely than men to be unfaithful. The survey also found that infidelity rates increase in middle age for both men and women, and that contrary to both social and literary stereotypes, women reach their highest levels of infidelity in their 60s. A is for analysis. While wives initiate almost 70% of divorces, the researcher Michael Rosenfeld recently made the surprising discovery that no similar gap between the sexes, or any gap at all, exists between the percentage of breakups initiated by women and men living together without marriage. Rosenfeld also found that although married women have long reported lower levels of satisfaction with relationship quality than married men, those in non-marital relationships reported equal levels of quality. These results, Rosenfeld said, quote, support the feminist assertion that some women experience heterosexual marriage as oppressive or uncomfortable, end quote. A is for adultery. In the United States, adultery remains illegal across 17 states. In Illinois, where A first kissed her lover, the wronged spouse can even sue the cheater's lover for alienation of affection. In Massachusetts, where A and her lover reinstigated their affair 2.0 after having been broken up for nearly 9 months, Adultery is a felony, theoretically punishable by up to life in prison. Then there's a series of A is for old, strike through it. A is for hag, strike. A is for crone, strike. A is for ancient. Various recent studies using extensive data from online dating services have revealed that women's perceived attractiveness by men hits its highest point at the age of 18 and declines steadily thereafter, Elizabeth Birch, and that the peak age of women's attractiveness is somewhere around 22 or 23, Christian Rudder. According to Rudder, co-founder of OkCupid, younger is better and youngest is best of all. For men, by contrast, attractiveness seems to increase steadily with age, peaking somewhere between 46 and 50. Given these facts, one might wonder what irrational force could possibly have prompted A to believe that she still matters enough for all this fuss to begin with, for all this inconveniencing of other upstanding people who had expectations of and plans involving her. Just look at the way she's carrying on, as though she honestly doesn't realize she is statistically unfuckable anyway. A is for the audacity of her. A is for animal testing. In Esther Perel's The State of Affairs, the author indicates that while rates of infidelity are on the incline, public compassion for adulterers is not. According to a 2017 Gallup poll, Americans have become more relaxed about most things sexual, from premarital to teen to gay sex, but adultery remains condemned at higher rates than abortion, animal testing, or euthanasia. A is for audience. Recently, A attended a party celebrating a novel about a married professor who gets a terrifying medical diagnosis and goes out and begins fucking her student. The novel's author began her reading that night by stating that if her middle-aged protagonist had been a man, there would likely be no book because nothing out of the ordinary would have happened. After the reading, all the audience really wanted to talk about was how immoral, inexcusable, and wrong the novel's protagonist was, pressing the author to concur with her judgments and thereby transforming her narrative of disruption into a narrative of reassurance. The author, trained as all women are to be agreeable in crowds, demurred that she did not recommend anyone trying her protagonist's behavior at home, but suggested that that might not be the point. One audience member even asserted that the very outrageousness of the protagonist's behavior qualified the novel as satire, even though everyone present, including the men, seemed to agree with the author that had the protagonist been a man, there would be no book at all. A is for Alice. A's mother, Alice, was once told by A's father that she should take a lover because A's father was no longer interested in sex, at least with his wife, and could not satisfy her. Although she had two opportunities that A knows of, altruistic Alice nonetheless remained faithful to her asexual husband, even past his death. A is for anti-heroine. This is not that kind of book, and I'll stop there.
Thank you, Gina, and thank you, Pam. Both extraordinary books. The question that we like to always ask is, what was your literary environment in your home growing up? What books did you read? What books were you exposed to as a child? And how did they figure in your becoming a writer? Either one of you can take it. Gina, take it.
I'll take it. So I grew up in a home with a father who had not graduated from the 8th grade. And he read newspapers voraciously, but he didn't really tend to read books. My mother, who graduated from high school but was not permitted to attend college, did read a lot before she had met my father. But my father, he was a very nice person, but he was quite clingy to my mother. And whenever she would start to read a book, he would say, "Aren't you going to talk to me? Aren't we going to go out and do this?" You know, so she didn't read anymore, really, by the time I was born. We didn't have the money to go out and purchase a lot of books for me, but I was an absolutely voracious reader. So my mother and I went to the library twice a week, pretty much throughout my entire early childhood. And I read everything they had in the children's section and some, you know, beyond the children's section before starting to just basically borrow books from my friends' parents. So libraries were really important to me. And I think, you know, we don't emphasize them as much as we used to.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a coincidence, Gina. My mother did not finish the 8th grade, and my father did not go to. I mean, neither of them went to college. So that's overlap. The only book I honestly remember in my childhood home that I read voraciously at 7 or 9 was The Valley of the Dolls. I remember that very clearly. That was a book in my house. And my father's Playboys. But I had another person in my life, Martha Washington, she was a babysitter really, who kind of stayed around until I was 21. She didn't live with us, but she did teach me she was my most consistent babysitter. And she taught me to read when I was about 2.5. So when I was in nursery school, they pulled me out of nursery school and had me read to the 3rd graders or something. Like I was kind of like a reading prodigy. And so then, because I was good at it and I got praised for it, I just did it all the time. And so, I was the one who brought books into the house, and it was, Dr. Seuss and Mrs. Pigglewiggle and My Secret Garden, The Secret Garden, and Judy Blume, and it was basically all the horse books, all the horse series, Misty of Chincoteague. Like I could go on and on, but reading was my own. I was an only child. My parents were mostly drunk, and I really had a big, vast inner life with the books I was reading. They kind of made my childhood in a certain way. Like my childhood memories are confused with memories of things that happened to characters in books.
I'm an only child as well, so it's really wild, the parallels. But yeah, parallels. Absolutely. I too, just as Pam was describing, like my inner life was so much focused on books, wanting to kind of escape my actual environment that I was in and sort of living through the books that I read. The most formative early book I read was probably The Changeling by Zilpha Keatley Schneider. I was obsessed with that book. But then by the age of about 10 or 11, we were all reading, the V.C. Andrews and Flowers in the Attic and Sidney Sheldon and all kind of like the books that my friends' divorced mothers were reading. And so we were reading these when we were like 11. So, and this was an era where also like Luke was raping Laura on television and then marrying her. So it was a very like, rape as a form of romance was a really big thing in both the popular novels and in television at that time. So that sort of, kind of can't be discounted. And I think like the formative reading experiences of people of my generation.
Okay, I'm fascinated by that, because one of the things that I loved about your book, Gina, so I firmly believe that play is a place where we sort of work out the structural issues that we live under. And for adults, sex is play, right? And so one of the things I loved is that the narrator has this relationship with her husband where the structural issues that we live under are like foremost. And then she has this relationship with her lover where those structural issues get played out through sex, so that the relationship outside of sex doesn't carry that. And so then to see that, I read all of those books too, but I had not made that link to my own like present day sex life. Thank you. But so then one of the questions I had for you as well, we talk a lot about literary lineages in this series, sort of who you claim. So I was wondering if you had some writers that offered you sort of guidance or stepping stones in writing about sex in the way that you do in the book.
So, there was a transition in my life, and probably Pam's as well, and probably most young people, between when did we begin to read more literary work? And for me, with the exception of reading a few things that I really loved in high school, that really didn't take place until college, that I started to read, commercial, non-pop fiction on my own time. And I would definitely say that when I started reading the work of Mary Gateskill, Kathy Acker, people like that, it blew my head open, because my inner life had been very shaped by this kind of problematic narrative where we were taught to be titillated by the same things that we would see happening in the outer world: rape, abuse of women, control exerted by men, girls being sexually abused or physically abused. And that was obviously terrifying and not sexy, and yet internalizing some of what we had read as kids. So I think that when I read Mary Gateskill for the first time, I was already writing. I'd been writing since I was 4. I had already written like 4, handwritten novels. I was taking creative writing in college. But when I read Mary Gateskill for the first time, I was like, oh, wait, we are allowed to kind of grapple with this in our work. Like, fiction can grapple with these issues, and that changed the way that I wrote. Milan Kundera too, but in not the same way. I mean, he's sexually problematic, but I found him and his sexual psychology that he put in books very interesting, so those two were really formative to me when I was about 19.
Similar question for Pam. Your books, you've got such an intense relationship with the land, and there are other nature writers that I've read that have really been inspiring, though I have to say yours have brought me the closest to that visceral experience one gets from reading, in terms of transforming my understanding and what it would be like to be in that kind of a place. Are there writers, nature writers, are there people who particularly have influenced you, gave you permission, as it were, to go in that direction, to bring places in as a character?
Yeah, for sure. I was just visiting the Willa Cather Prairie a couple of weeks ago, and Cather remains super important to me. Not just about her relationship to the land, but her kind of gender fluidity and all kinds of other things that I sort of am, like one way to describe the process of my life was, realizing I could be the cowboy, which is something, that that is said too often about me, to the point where it becomes a bumper sticker. But I really came out west, fell completely in love with the landscape because of the books of Edward Abbey, because of Gretel Ehrlich, because of Terry Tempest Williams. But also in a weird way because of D.H. Lawrence, and because of Willa Cather, and sort of the intersection of like how you could be a man and a woman at the same time, and the land could, and Whitman, Whitman, like how the relationship between like loving the land and loving yourself in whatever state your body was and whatever your desires were, all of that was a big soup for me. And when I first got to the West, which is now 40, wait, yeah, almost 40 years ago, I thought, I thought, oh, this belongs to the men, and I need the men to translate it for me in a way that like Lawrence's England wasn't, but then I understood that I was wrong, that I could have my own visceral, sensual experience with the American West and the Colorado Plateau in particular, similarly to how Willa Cather writes about the prairie. And so anyway, that those, I said a bunch of names, like those were kind of the names. But just having been to the Willa Cather Prairie and walked on it just a couple of weeks ago, like it's really up in my mind how much she gave me permission, and particularly with Maya Tania, though I could cite examples from all her books that were different kinds of permission in different ways.
Your book, I grew up as much as I could with our one little television in our house, watching Westerns, which I could only do if I was the only one watching, because my mother and sister were much more into this, the, what do you call it? The ideal 50s kinds of father knows best sort of thing. But I always thought, if I could be a cowboy, I mean, I will be a cowboy. I rode horses. My so when I saw your book about, you know, Cowboys is my weak, also I'm blanking, Cowboys are my weakness, I bought it literally for the title. And it was the same sort of thing of like, I didn't even realize that I was identifying with men, that I wanted a life that a man could easily move into, that a girl really would have to forge and fight her way into. And it wasn't until in my early 20s, I was tree planting in British Columbia. And I had gone there because of very close male friends of mine who that was their lifestyle. And I wanted in on it. They, you know, in between seasons, they would travel to these amazing places. And that to me was very ideal. And it wasn't until I was out there and really doing the rigorous work that I realized that the people who I emulated were all men. And that, you know, here I am, a girl having grown up in urban Los Angeles. And I had such a view of myself as being a man that would go off onto the Wild West and who would go and plant, you know, 1,000 trees a day. And it was quite a revelation when I realized, you know, I'm not a man, and there's no shame, there's no humiliation, there's no, I mean, I felt such shame because I couldn't accomplish what they had accomplished. And it turned my life around, that realization. And so I really identify with your process as well.
Yeah, you know, I was just on this ranch. This isn't very literary, but I was just on this ranch in the San Luis Valley of Colorado near the Great Sand Dunes National Monument. I was teaching there for a week, and the entire operation is run by 17 women. And when I say and they're all young women. And when I say the entire operation, I mean 2,000 bison, 200 head of cattle, a herd of 75 horses, and 3 seasons of guests. And they do everything. And it's like being in a kind of paradise, because it's like cowboying without the toxic masculinity at all. And it was heaven to be there. It was like being in heaven. But there was a New York Times reporter had been there to do a story on this place because of its uniqueness. They're restoring, they're building a whole massive corridor with, you know, for wildlife. It's beautiful. Everything that's happening there is beautiful. But the New York Times reporter came out to do a story on how the women are remaking this landscape into something much more like it ought to have been. And the photographer was like, well, when did the cowboys come in? And the women were like, what? And he's like, well, when did the cowboys come in from working with the cows? And these women are like, no, we're the cowboys. Like, we're the cow. I mean, they were there to do a story on it. And they still thought there were some of these mysterious cowboys out there, because if there were cows, there had to be cowboys, and they had to be male. And it was just incredible. It was an incredible experience in all ways. But like, that's how deep that idea is, you know? Yeah. And like, even at the end, this photographer was kind of sure that they were keeping something from him. There's like one man on the whole ranch, and he's in the kitchen. He's the chef.
Oh, I love that.
Love that, yeah.
Yeah.
What's the name of the ranch?
It's the Zapata Ranch, and it's part of an organization called Ranchlands, which is all about conservation. It is about keeping, you know, keeping what's good about ranching and trying to lose what's harmful. And I don't know, you know, I don't know how that works in the large scope of the organization, but I see how it works at this one. They own 8 or 9 ranches, and this is one. And it's miraculous what's happening there, honestly.
I'm going to look it up. Cowboys have always been my weakness. Is one of the reasons I knew I had to take my son and his friends camping on my own. I mean, totally like a little nothing compared to running a ranch, but it was true in my life. And then Gina, I related so much to the scenes in the memoir where the narrator is like scrubbing the blood up and singing the song for her son, and trying to make it all okay. I mean, that level of emotional caretaking and physical caretaking for the entire family.
Yeah. You know, that it's interesting because obviously one of the things that can be problematic in a critique of you know, gender roles in families is people then making the assumption that, you know, oh, well, feminism means women doing no emotional caretaking at all, caring only about ourselves. Just yesterday, my book was in a roundup in the San Francisco Chronicle that was sort of praising it. And yet one of the claims was that I had left my husband and children for my lover, which is factually untrue and bizarre since I've always had majority time with my kids. So, I mean, I loved my parents a lot. I miss them. They both passed away now. And I didn't mind at all having them in my home, and, you know, being close up and personal with all of the things that entailed. But it also is very draining when women are in a situation where we may be between children and parents all alive at the same time. When parents are old, children are young. Most women, of course, these days, as I did, also had work outside of the home, you know, and so I think sometimes the level of superhuman performance expected of women domestically and emotionally is obviously excessive. And I do try to explore that in the book, while also trying to explore the fact that we do choose some things that bind us and some things that we are responsible for, you know. So I also will just say briefly that everything Pam was talking about in terms of, you know, cowboys and Jody as well, reminds me a lot of the traveler subculture, which I write about in some of my fiction and a bit in my nonfiction. You know, I originally definitely felt as though in order to travel and be a traveler, I had to sort of be affiliated with some man, because when you would enter kind of a traveler subculture, a squatter subculture, that sort of thing, the men seemed to outnumber the women, sometimes, you know, 10-1. And so it was always very interesting. And I love travel novels. Like I love expat novels, things like, you know, Durrell's Alexandria Quartet. I love Francesca Marciano's The Rules of the Wild. And the idea that somehow we have to always have like a man as a conduit to some place we want to be or something we want to be is a really fascinating thing to me that I've definitely kind of struggled with as well in my personal life as well as my work.
It's very much a commonality amongst women, especially women of, I mean, there's an age span here. I realize that probably close to 20 years. I'm close to 70. And so I grew up in an environment in the 50s where the men, there was no question that men were the conduit. But that said, I want to get back to books. So what books are you both reading? What books would you even recommend? What books that, talk about the books that you're drawn to now, not even necessarily, well, as a reader, but also as a writer. And even feel free to have the conversation amongst the two of you.
I can speak first. I can just talk about some books that have really been meaningful to me in this last year and a half. I had a reading series at my organization, Writing by Writers, which led to, Gina was on it as one of our guests. It led to me having to, or getting to, read a book a week, because I did an interview a week almost throughout the whole pandemic. And so there were certain books that stood out to me. Definitely Gina's one of them, Blow Your House Down. Some other titles that I would just highly recommend, or that seem to me like kind of at the crux of what I'm thinking about right now and what I'm interested in thinking about right now. Carolyn Forche's memoir, What You Have Heard Is True. Probably the single best memoir I've ever read. I know that's going out on a limb, but it's such a powerful, important book for right now. Tony Jensen's book, Carrie, which is a book about gun violence and, or guns and violence toward women. And the links between them. It's a book of essays, super important book. And then there's a novel by Jamie Figueroa called Brother, Sister, Mother, Explorer, which has these characters in them called the grandmothers to us all. And they seem like kind of funny older women who ride around on bicycles and wear floppy hats and stuff. But in fact, they're like helping trafficked women in northern New Mexico. It's a book that's set in Santa Fe. It's a very beautiful book. Those are three right off the top of my head, really standout books of the last year that feel like they're really helping me understand how to be now and what to do and how to help, you know, in certain ways. So those are just three to start off the conversation.
I had a writing teacher, Oscar Melichik, who talked about having go-to books, like whatever he was writing, there were like a series of books, maybe 4 or 5 books that were his perennial, when he needed to be jarred, when he needed to be, when he needed to understand even better what he was writing. Do you have that sort of a collection, Pam?
I do. It would be, this will be hard. It would be Toni Morrison's Jazz. It would be Robert Boswell's Tumble Down. Big fat novel, incredible novel. Not a novel like I would ever write, but it is very inspiring to me, that book. And then I would have to add poetry. You know, I get super inspired by poetry. Lately, Jericho Brown's The Tradition. John Davis is a poet I've always admired, has always gotten me inspired. I mean, this is such a long list. I could go on for 100 years, honestly. Alice Munro's, back to prose, Alice Munro's Hate Ship, Love Ship, Friendship, Courtship, Marriage is a really important book on my shelf. Mary Gateskill, to bring it back to her, Mary Gateskill's Don't Cry. And before that, her earlier collections of stories. There's a book by Tim Winton called The Turning. He's an Australian novelist and short story writer. That story, The Turning, and another story of his called Aquifer. These are stories that I read again and again because they either, like with Jazz, where she's doing something that I couldn't do. Like, you know, if someone replaced my brain, I couldn't write Jazz, of course. But it just, the fact that she can do it makes me want to try harder. And then there's other people like Gateskill or Lori Moore, who I get what they're doing. I get it, you know, and I think, okay, this can really help me do what I do because of the parallels there. So I sort of have 2 stacks. I have the wow, off the charts inspiration. And then I have this is a practitioner doing what I'm doing and doing it really well. Those are kind of my 2 stacks.
All right.
Gina, what are you reading? What do you have go-to books as well?
So I would say probably the 2 books that I've been evangelizing about the most in maybe the last 6 months are Janine Noulette's The Part That Burns, and which is, I've done a couple of events with her and I think it's just amazing. And then Nina Renata Aaron's Good Night Destroyer of Men's Souls, or is it Good Morning Destroyer of Men's Souls? Now I'm gonna like drive myself crazy because I just messed that up. It's amazing, and I had never heard of her work prior to her writing me a just killer review on the Los Angeles Review of Books, where I edit, of the final book in the Copenhagen trilogy. And I loved this review so much that I wrote Nina a fan letter, and because she just submitted it, and I was like, this is just one of the greatest reviews I've ever read. And so that led me to her book, which is all about, it's basically about women's relationship with codependence. But it's you know, it's not a self-help book. It's a really gritty, real book that says the things that, you know, we're not supposed to be allowed to say. I have a lot of go-to books. Probably, I mean, also Toni Morrison. I love Beloved. I love the structure, which I think I see Faulkner's Absalom, Toni Morrison's Beloved, and Arundhati Roy at God of Small Things as all having this kind of structure that I'm fascinated by, where there's a central traumatic event and the book sort of circles around it until it gets to the eye of the storm. And I mean, these are three obviously completely different writers. Arundhati Roy may not even have grown up reading these writers because she was from another country, but that style has always fascinated me. Recently, well, my business partner, Emily Rapp Black, who I credit with a lot of kind of bringing me to a fascination with what nonfiction can do. I had always been predominantly a fiction writer. I wrote short form nonfiction, but I didn't consider it, I think, to be quite the same artistic mode that I considered fiction. And I came to really realize that I was incredibly wrong about that, partly through the work of Emily Rapp Black, who also has 2 books out right now, Sanctuary and a book on Frida Kahlo that came out in both the UK and in the United States. Pam's short essay, Corn Maze, is also just one of my, I mean, I teach that essay in every single class I ever teach, because I think that it explores the idea. Well, first of all, it's a perfect mirror of form and content. But second of all, because it'll sort of tell you about something that, something that you can do or something that can be done. And then it'll do it slyly. And you kind of don't even know that's happening until you've read it, 6, 7 times. You're like, now I've cracked the code of this. So I make my students read it aloud so that I can like gleefully point things out to them as I go along. But also just even hearkening back to other older works, I'm always revisiting Maxine Hung Kingston's The Woman Warrior, which I think, to me, it's the first majorly important work of creative nonfiction I ever read that just kind of made my head explode in the way that novels did, and that showed me what can be done in the terrain of nonfiction, where essentially, as long as you are the lens and you, the author, narrator, keep things kind of reflected through the prism of yourself, you can go anywhere. She writes about ghosts. She writes about relatives who may or may not have existed in China. She writes about fables and shaman and things like that. And, while my work is much more grounded, that really showed me that even way back in 1971 or so, creative nonfiction was just kind of like an explosive thing to explore. Other memoirs that have influenced me a lot in kind of the writing of my memoir, Claire Detterer's Love and Trouble, for sure. I loved it because I wanted my book to have an overarching narrative where everything kind of comes together, but I also wanted to tell it in a lot of different ways. I wanted to come at it from different stylistics. And I feel like Love and Trouble did that very successfully, so that gave me kind of faith that I could do it, and then obviously Margaret Atwood. I mean, I revere her and have read all of her work. So, yeah, I could go on.
It's wonderful. We have just a couple of minutes left. Let's see what we have in the Q&A. Let's see. Pam, did you get a concussion from shaking your head over the response to Cowboys? Did visions of your graduate professors and advisors eating murders of Crow because they were so wrong about its validity and legitimacy bring a warm glow to your hammered writer's heart? Would beginning writer you have believed such a reception of something you were to write? Oh, you're muted.
Yeah, that's a lot of questions. The truth is, those two things were happening simultaneously in my life. Like when Cowboys became as popular as it was, this is an honest answer, it was very confusing to me. Like my major response was confusion, because on the one hand, my professors were saying I glorified an archaic form of masculinity and I set feminism back 50 years. And on the other hand, I was on, you know, All Things Considered. You know, like, it was a weird time. And on the one hand, I was getting like hate mail from self-identified feminists. And on the other hand, the organization now was asking for a case of signed books to auction off at their fundraiser. So it was a very dizzying time. And, you know, most writers, myself included, are always hearing the criticism louder than the praise. And so even though the praise or, you know, the positive results of publishing that book were way outweighing just in terms of volume, the criticisms, of course, the criticism is what stuck to me. And, you know, now that I'm older and I understand more about what Keats called negative capability, like I understand that those two responses to the book were appropriate. You know, like, I don't want to write a book that everybody loves. You know, did I know that when I was 28? Maybe not, you know. And I think about that with Gina's book, because Gina's book like riled so many people up. And, you know, that's the best thing that can, I mean, that if we're not riling people up, we're doing it wrong, you know. And so now I look back on the Cowboys experience when I was so scared to screw up and so scared that I was going to disappoint my publisher, or so scared that, you know, that I was going to hurt somebody's feelings or make my professors mad, or, you know, like all those things I was afraid of. Like now, you know, I wouldn't exactly feel that way. You know, I would feel like, well, some people are going to like this. It's going to make some people really mad. And that must mean I'm doing it right, you know? And so, anyway, I have great affection for that book and those stories and that girl who wrote them. You know, I didn't know very much, but I was trying to learn. And I, you know, to me, it feels like I wrote the stories 100,000 years ago. You know, people will be like, you know, in What Shock Heard? And I'm like, no, sorry, no memory of it. But if you tell me, I'll listen, you know. If you tell me what happened in that story, I'll listen. So anyway, I hope that's an answer to the question. I am so grateful. I mean, probably sorry about the plane. I'm so grateful. My main feeling about that book is gratitude, because it sold a whole lot of copies and it made it so I could be a writer for the rest of my life. And any told you so feelings I have toward any of my professors are very tiny in the shadow of that larger feeling of gratitude, honestly.
Do you have anything that you want to say following that, Gina, about the like living with the negative capabilities?
I think, well, the thing that resonated most with me about what Pam said, first of all, I've never been particularly interested in reading crowd-pleasing books. And so as a writer, I mean, even as a fiction writer, I had very little interest in writing crowd-pleasing books. Like, I think, you know, every form of entertainment has its own complete legitimacy, but I've always been interested in writing things that ask more questions or spark more debate than offer answers or inspiration, you know. But yeah, the other thing that struck me about what Pam was saying is sort of when you, as a woman who's now in your 50s or older, you know, look back on your own earlier body of work. I mean, I think Pam and I have both been working with issues of gender politics like throughout our entire careers. And I always considered myself a feminist writer. But when I go back and read things that I wrote in, say, the 1990s, what I meant by feminism was different than what it is now. And I think that in particular, one of the things that I fell into and that was incredibly in vogue in the like 80s and 90s was the idea that women's rebellion to patriarchy, to sexism, was self-destruction. Like that the only sane response to a woman hating world or an insane world was basically like madness or self-annihilation. And I think that there has been a lot of fetishization of that in film, in, you know, in television. And I think that some of my own earlier work, while I did not want it to be doing that, I think some of my own earlier work did some of that. And I view it differently now through the lens of today, even though I still do have affection for, you know, for those stories and books.
So Ginger, I know what time it is.
I know.
The question, but we had talked about the one question we'd hoped that Pam and Gina would have time to respond to is do they have any questions of each other in terms of their literary lives, as it were? Can we do that, or do we have to chop it off?
Do you have any questions that you want to ask each other in the next 2 minutes? Go.
I can ask Gina a question. I was teaching all morning, and this is a question that came up. And I want to ask a question like about white women. and maybe this isn't quite as bookish as it might be for this, but okay, we're white women who write books. We're white women who are appalled at what's happening in our communities and in our countries. What if I were to say, okay, I teach, I try to elevate voices of color, I try to elevate voices of women, every opportunity I get, in many ways, in the syllabi I make, in the writers I work with. What aren't we doing? Like, what aren't we doing that we could be doing? I know that's an impossible question, but I am interested in your answer, if you have any, because you're one of the more ferocious people I know. And I absolutely believe that it's up to the ferocious women now. Like, I think we're the only ones who can stop this train. And so what do you think about that?
So I have so many thoughts about that, largely because, you know, like you, I teach, and of course we write, and I've also worked as an editor for most of my adult life. And, you know, I think that there is a very deep systemic problem in publishing. You know, yes, you can assign works by writers of color. By all means, if you're not doing that, like, you're clearly doing something wrong at this point. Assigning works by queer writers, all of these things. But I will tell you that when I work as an editor, it is very difficult to get anything like proportional submissions from non-white writers because of the way the literary world is so marginalized in the economy. And to a very large extent, like, online publications, things like LARB, things like The Rumpus, things like The Nervous Breakdown, you know, LitHub, all of these things. I love these sites, and everyone is well-intended. And sometimes, you know, there are plenty of editors of color and so forth, but writing isn't being fairly compensated. And so people who are poor, people who have been marginalized from education, any type of person who is not basically coming from a position of economic and educational privilege is going to have a very difficult time with the expectation that you just produce for essentially exposure, and you cannot make a living on your work. And, you know, so when I am going out on, you know, in Facebook groups or something and saying, like, I'm looking for book reviewers of color, I can pay $100. You know, I hear myself, and I'm not in charge of the money, but like, I hear myself saying to myself, why should they give me their labor if that's what, you know? And so I think that really online publishing super advances for writers who are getting $5 million advances, and then other writers are getting no advance. Like, this sort of non-equity within the publishing world, and the way that publishing is, you know, is so often outside the economy, is definitely not making it easier to diversify publishing, you know, and I think too many people are just pointing at a few successful books written by writers of color, written by queer writers, written by women, written by people who are poor. I mean, you know, Pam and I both grew up poor, you know, and saying like, oh, it's fine, see these successful books, but there aren't enough of them. There are far, far too many of them. And it starts from the bottom up. If you cannot convince people to even study writing because there's no viable job they can get. You know, I did not major in creative writing. I majored in psychology. I have a master's in psychology. I grew up below the poverty line. I did not think writing was a viable thing for me. That's even more true now than it was when I was going to college. So there is our problem.
Great. Thanks.
Question to Pam.
I would
love, we do have to keep it, I mean, yeah. Sure.
So because I teach Pam's work so much, and I've now just written a memoir for the first, you know, time, I would love it if Pam would have a chance to speak to the audience a little bit about, you know, two of the things that I think are really fascinating in her work, and that is the difference between emotional truth versus fact, and the idea of sort of autobiographical fiction and memoir / creative nonfiction really kind of bleeding into each other, so that, you know, yeah, so. Yeah,
I can do that quickly. I could talk about that for like 3.5 hours, but, you know, I'm really interested in this term autofiction that we're now saying. We started saying it a few years ago. I think when Lydia Davis wrote the intro to A Manual for Cleaning Women, that she said it, and then everybody started saying it. And I feel in a certain way legitimized by it. Like, I'm not a big labeler and I don't really give a shit about them, but I like that we're calling something autofiction, because it seemed to me that the alternative was that, you know, with all of this, if you don't know it, how it happened exactly, then you can't call it nonfiction. Like, it seemed to me that the antecedent of that was going to be, well, if it really happened to you, then you can't call it fiction, right? Like, which I felt like we were in danger for a minute of going down that road. There was some piece in the Times that was headed that way. So I like that they've kind of given people like me a category. And it's true. I mean, I learned many, many things writing my memoir, which you might find interesting because you might have learned some of them too. But what I learned, what makes Deep Creek really, which is the memoir I wrote prior to Airman, what made Deep Creek really different than any of my other books, which are largely classified as fiction, even though most of the things in them happened to me in some form, is that with Deep Creek, like, I just made it a point to say, all right, I'm not going to do that. Like, if things get dull, I'm not going to blow up a car. I'm not going to have a sexy Italian walk in and deliver a line. Like, if things get dull, I'm just going to sit in my own dullness and wait for it to get more interesting. And that was kind of what I set out to do. Like, in my mind, that was my definition of writing a memoir. Like, I was like, this is why this is a memoir. This is a memoir because when things get dull, I'm not going to make anything up. And as you know from Corn Maze, sometimes in magazine articles, I do. So this was really different. Like, I was like, I'm just going to sit in my own dullness, and maybe all that dullness will soak into the soil, and maybe a flower will grow like out of all that dullness. And as a result, the book took me 8 years, which a book has never taken me before, because I had to wait on myself. And it turns out that waiting is the hardest and worst thing for me. I hate waiting. Two more things I want to say about that, and I'll stop. One is that in spite of that promise I made to myself, and in spite of my determination not to make anything up, if we looked at Deep Creek right now, we could probably find an untruth on every page, if I could even remember what was true and what wasn't true, which I probably can't at this point. Not an intentional untruth, but as I talk about in Corn Maze, which is available online if anybody wants to read it, like, you know, language is imperfect, memory is imperfect, our desires get in the way of how we tell our stories. That's one thing. And the other thing I want to say is it was good that I did that. It was good for the book, and it was good for me. It was good to have to sit in my own shit for a long time. I don't think Deep Creek would be the book it was if I had gotten up to my old tricks and made a scene more interesting on purpose, even though it didn't quite happen that way. I didn't do that in Deep Creek, and I had to wait. And the waiting yielded some kinds of, a certain kind of depth that I wasn't expecting. I hoped that it would. I banked on it doing that, and then it did.
This has been fantastic. I've loved the conversation. I don't want to hold either of you any longer. I do want to answer this question. Gina, what independent bookstore would you like us to support by ordering your memoir?
So I mean, my favorite store is Women and Children First in Chicago. It is one of the last remaining feminist bookstores in the country. The royalties for Blow Your House Down are going to a woman's organization called Deborah's Place that helps women who are facing homelessness. And although they're not doing it anymore, Women and Children First collaborated with me at the beginning of that effort for my launch party and donated proceeds from the launch party to that effort as well. So, you know, definitely I'd love if they could kind of get a little back out of that and people order from them.
All right. That's a great shout out. Okay, well, thank you both so much. I'm going to be listening to this again tonight and starting to read. I haven't read Corn Maze, for instance, so I'll be reading it this evening. And everyone else, thanks so much I forgot we even had attendees. Thanks so much for attending Who Writers Read. The next show will be on Wednesday, September 22nd, 2 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We'll have Sven Burkertz, the co-editor of Agni and the former director of the Bennington Writing Seminars. He's the author of 11 books. His most recent is Speak Memory. And Martha Cooley, whose most recent novel is Buy Me Love. Her novel, The Archivist, was a national bestseller. So we hope to see you at that conversation as well. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Pam and Gina, so much. This has been fabulous. This is everything we'd hope for and more.
Excellent. Thank you.
Bye.
Great to see you always, Gina.
You too.